to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, your host, Vincent Perez. Today, I'm very excited to have my life partner, the love of my life, Kim Jansen, on. As of this recording, we're just a few months shy of 23 years of our union and our marriage. I would not have accomplished so much or done it so well without her support and collaboration. And I'm really grateful to wrap up this series in conversation with my wife. So, welcome, Kim.
Thank you.
As we start here, let's introduce you to the world. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your connection to education?
Kim Jansen. I'm an immigrant from the Netherlands. My mom is a teacher, which made me very much not want to be a teacher. I didn't really imagine being in education, even though I was always drawn to, I have younger siblings, so working with kids or being around kids. Even as I became a teenager, I was always kind of around my younger siblings. I just really liked witnessing growth and being a safe person and all those things. I got introduced to being an educator at CISPA's Learning Center because we moved our family there, and you were the challenge course director. And at the time, I would grudgingly go help facilitate. And now in hindsight, I'm really grateful. When we were talking the other day, you said seeing different groups go through the same thing, right? Through the same challenge, and seeing how groups would respond very differently or very similar is really fascinating. I got to work with a lot of high school students. 8th graders were my preference, and I was often accommodated in that. And seeing their insights, right? Those moments of when in Dutch, there's an expression, when the coin drops, that light bulb moment, when they see each other or themselves more clearly, is something that I'm really grateful for. And then we got trauma-informed training under the umbrella of this Association of Washington School Principals at the time, which now would be Association of Washington Student Leaders. And then we started doing professional development trainings for educators, administrators. And that's also something that deeply impacted my life and my practice and my parenting at the time, and still.
I think our exploration of trauma-informed approach, healing-centered engagement, as you mentioned, has changed so many things about, I would say, even how I treat myself or view my own experience. I see with softer eyes for the experience of my family members and obviously each other, and as you mentioned, our children. I'm curious about what in particular about this study or this learning and teaching around trauma-informed practice has emerged as really important to you? Or is there something that you would want to share in particular about this learning?
Something that I still say to myself, to others. We had this amazing trauma-informed training from a nurse named Raul, I think it was Nami, who one of the things that really stuck with me was comfort, not control. And our children were preteens at the time. I would say that out loud, just to myself, to you, right? Like, just as a reminder, the goal is comfort, not control. We're not trying to control these kids. We're trying to guide them. And learning is really hard when you're stressed, right? Like, so when students can relax, when they are fed, when they are welcomed, when they feel like they belong, then the real learning can happen. So initially, the biggest impact it had was on my parenting. I think I prevented getting into a lot of power struggles with my children by repeating that mantra. When you enter power struggles, and we do that as educators as well sometimes, often rooted in our trauma too, right? Like, so examining triggers, recognizing triggers, that was the other really big thing that came out of it for me. Having that awareness that, oh, I'm being triggered. This is not about them. I have this story about being on the challenge course and having a 6th grade student who we had certain rules on the challenge course. No running, no dropping of people or things, no climbing on anything until you've been instructed to do so. And I had one 6th grade boy kept running ahead on the trails, kept climbing on the next thing. And I had to keep reminding him. And for the first few times I did fine, right? Like, I'm still calm. I'm just like, hey, kiddo, remember the rules. And after the 3rd time, my body felt really tense and I wanted him to stop it. And I felt that, like, which is, wanted to strangle him a little bit. And that realization that strangulation is a really harsh punishment for being an enthusiastic 6th grade boy. And I had that moment of like recognition, like, oh, I feel like I'm not being heard, or a lot of us say not being respected, right? Like, which has to do with compliance, right? Like you're not doing what I'm telling you to do. And I think that moment when I was able to recognize, oh, I don't feel heard. And that is rooted in trauma for me. And that makes me this tense. The moment I realized that, my body relaxed. Like that whole tension thing just went. And it's something that always stuck with me. Because before then, I was kind of in a victim position, right? Like this kid is doing this to me, when it's really, I'm running into my own trigger. And when that happens, it's really good to kind of ground myself, take the group back off the course, go over the rules, but really take a moment to breathe. Like take a moment to realize and understand that some kids are enthusiastic and want to run to the next thing, and punishment is not necessarily an appropriate response to that.
Just being a child.
For just being an enthusiastic child. It's not like he's dragging his feet to the next thing and be like, this is lame, right? Like he's not hurting anyone. He's not using foul language or attacking anyone. His behavior is really benevolent, and like I said, it stuck with me. And he's enthusiastic. I want to harness that. I don't want to squash that, right? Because I'm running into something that is mine, that I'm carrying, that is in my trauma history.
I think in terms of all of the trainings we've been able to do with educators and, co-teaching with you, this story and this reality of, as adults, that we are fired and our nervous systems are heightened due to a child's behavior, and really working through the fact that there's an asymmetrical relationship, to begin with, and to start the whole thing out, but that we are the adults and we often adhere to these very kind of stringent or strict rules of compliance, and you behave in this manner or this way. I think that does somehow, I don't know, it has an impact on obviously the learning environment. But if we don't know as adults our own triggers, and note that this is actually has nothing to do with the situation at hand, it has everything to do with our history.
Yeah.
And how we respond, and our body responds to seeming affronts, which are really just kids being kids.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if there's this balance between, what's appropriate, right, without doing harm for young people to behave, but also for us not to do harm as adults with young people.
Oh, I like how you often talk about abundant grace, right? Like for ourselves and for our students, because it's really easy too in those trigger moments to wonder like what's wrong with us, right? Like, or to feel broken. And another mantra that you and I have picked up from Raul was, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And then you can allow yourself to be like, oh yeah, of course I'm responding this way. Why wouldn't I respond this way? Because a lot of traumatic things have happened to me. And it's, while it is valid, it's not a reason to then perpetuate harm, right? Like, so the balance of those two. And I also think that recognizing our emotions, our triggers is really important, so that we don't assume that it's logic, right? Like, and I've since really examined the words respect and discipline too. I always want to know, when people talk about respect, what do you mean when you say respect? Because it often means compliance. What do you mean when you say discipline? Because it often means punishment. That is a somewhat limited view, right? Like what is actually possible within, how can you feel respected without needing people to do exactly what you say? Or how can you discipline without it necessarily being only about punishment, about retribution, right? How can we repair and heal together, understand better?
Just the other day with my students who are incarcerated, young men almost, from the ages of 19 to 23, 24, we're examining this discipline issue and thinking about, how does pure punishment actually bring about learning especially when we do harm?
Yeah.
There's actually no learning in how to repair the harm or how to examine the harm being done or one's own behaviors. There's just this compliance forced upon us, and we say it's discipline and restrictions or suspension or all the things that they experienced all the way into their incarceration, right, in schools. And they really talked about, that didn't teach me anything. Actually made me more angry and want to really kind of go against the system, right?
Yeah. And it actually prevents the kind of reflection that would motivate someone to change their behavior, right? Like thinking about especially when we were young parents, and we make a lot of mistakes, right? Like there's lots of moments where it's like, I shouldn't have done that. And we often went to bed talking about or thinking about what could I have done differently? What will I do differently next time? And I think that is so important, right? Like that reflection of being allowed space and staying out of shame so that you can really examine what happened here. Yeah. And that has definitely helped me in my life to continue to grow.
So with this big question I've been holding for this podcast, I'm curious about your perspective, especially in all the programs we've been able to do together, from La Cima Bilingual Leadership, Migrant Ed's Dare to Dream Academies at all these 5 universities in Washington State, your contributions to all of that curriculum and teaching. What is the purpose of public education?
I struggle with what I think it is and what I think it ought to be. So talking about discipline and compliance, right? Like that is, I think, how it is built to teach discipline and compliance, to make compliant workers, to create a workforce, basically, right? Like, which also upholds capitalism, and that we can follow that thread. What I think it ought to be, I really like what you say, fostering stable, healthy, ideally happy human beings, right? Like, how do we get to making our way in the world while feeling good about ourselves, and ideally also doing good in the world, right? Like taking care of ourselves and each other. And I have a lot of critiques about it. It's partly the programs that you've created, Dare to Dream, La Cima, La Chispa. When you see students who have not experienced a sense of belonging very often experience that sense of belonging, it also shows what's missing, right? Like I have these small moments with students that were big to them, that later, like it should be an uplifting story, but it just makes me sad. We were at Central Washington University once for Dare to Dream Academy, Exploring Your Future. That's the incoming 9th and 10th graders. No, yes? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we had the cafeteria all to ourselves. And so I was with about 100 9th and 10th graders. And then there were the juniors, incoming juniors and seniors were in a science academy. So I only saw them for a brief moment in the morning. They didn't really know me. And we were having lunch. And there's nobody else there. It's just our program. It's reserved for just us. And I walked by, and I do a lot of what I call smile therapy, where you just smile at students a lot because they like you better and you like them better. It sends positive signals to your brain. Like even if you were to put a pencil in your mouth and pull the corners of your mouth back, it sends signals to your brain. I always think about the students in our school systems who are not smiled at, right? Like who don't have that experience, and so don't get to smile back either, because we kind of mirror that, right? And so I'm just walking around. I've already eaten, and there's this small group, 5 or 6 of the junior and senior students sitting in a little booth, and they're playing music, not very loud. Like I couldn't hear it walking up. I only heard it when I was very close to them. So I'm smiling at them. I'm kind of bobbing my head to the music, and they're like, Miss, is this okay? Is it okay if we play our music? And I just kind of gestured around. I was like, we have this place to ourselves. Why wouldn't it be? I think you can turn it up. And they said, really? We can turn it up? And so they turned up their music. And across from the cafeteria, one of the cafeteria workers, this is a Spanish-speaking program or a bilingual program. Cafeteria worker is also Latina, and she starts dancing. And they can see her across the way start to dance to this music as they turn it up. And it's this beautiful moment where they just get to bring their whole selves, right? Like, it's a really fun moment, but it's tiny. And the next day they come to me during lunch, and they all kind of swarm around me and hug me and said, thank you so much for playing my music. And that breaks my heart, because I don't think a mainstream white student would have that response, right? Like that overwhelming sense of gratitude for such a small moment. And I've had many like that, where I'm like, this should not be a big deal. This is painful that it is. Right, like that these moments of belonging, these moments of getting to bring your whole self, of playing the music that you would play at home, that then elicits this response from somebody else who is tied to your community or your culture, that they get so little of that. It still breaks my heart to this day that they felt that they needed to thank me, because it seems like that should just be a normal part of their day, right? So lots of moments like that. I think what I've seen you create, the learning spaces that I've seen you create, that I've been privileged enough to be part of, you create that sense of belonging. And I also see students feel empowered and go back into their learning environments, into their schools, feeling like they can do some things, feeling like they can be themselves, feeling like they can bring their friends along, right? Like they can uplift others, like they have a voice. What I've seen over and over is that is very much missing for those students that we serve, that they have those moments in those learning environments, but not outside of them.
You know, smiling is such a simple act, right? Such a simple way to be humans with humans, but having this kind of profound experience, right? For that, the students would come back in gratitude and say how, I mean, kind of paint, you're right. It paints how much this isn't their lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
And how being seen and heard and respected and encouraged would allow this to happen. I'm curious then, what other approaches would you offer, or have you witnessed or seen or practiced that support this kind of ideal of an empowering educational experience, really culturally affirming educational experience, even as simple as music? In your experience with all these projects and programs, what have you seen really work?
There are a few simple things, right? Like smiling, like music. I smile a lot at students that I have a hard time with too, right? Like, because I don't want to perpetuate the same or create the same kind of environment that they're already so overly familiar with. I think especially our teenage boys of color are often looked at with suspicion, right? Like, or like, we're ready to jump in, we're ready to discipline. And I had a moment with another student at La Cima once where he was being kind of disruptive during one of the presentations. I'm sitting behind him, and I had that experience of feeling disrespected, right? Like he was just kind of clowning around, and he's, around his peers, he's popular. But I did feel this firing in me. And so I was like, okay, proceed with caution from my end, right? Like that I'm not doing harm or putting something on him that I'm projecting. And there was a later moment when he's outside playing soccer with other students, and it was time to come back in. And I walked up to him and smiled big and said, hey, can you help me gather everybody back around? I noticed that you have some influence here. And so building him up in that role of like, hey, you are a popular person, so that means that you have some power. And I saw him later after we had gone in for lunch. He was sitting outside in kind of the lobby area. This was back in Chihuahua Peak. And I just walked out of the cafeteria. I saw him with his headphones in, and he's just sitting out there by himself. He's not doing anything. And he pulls out his headphones. I just smile at him. He's like, I'm not doing anything. I just needed a moment. Again, like this breaks my heart, right? Like he's not graffitiing the walls, right? Like he's just sitting with his headphones in. And I don't know if he would have said what he was experiencing in that moment if I hadn't just smiled at him, right? Like if he would have been more defiant because he would have felt like I was suspicious or like I was ready to discipline. But I've also noticed when we do La Chispas and those middle school students arrive and they hear music that in the language that they speak at home, that they are familiar with, there is something that shifts for them as they come in. Like it is, you can see it, right? Like it's this palpable thing where they're like, oh, I belong here. So those are small things. Something that I've noticed, and that I have felt really empowered in myself a few times is affinity spaces. So La Cima does that, La Chispa, Dare to Dream, honoring two languages, honoring home cultures, but also we've done work with gender-specific groups, right? Like where we have, we talk to just the boys, the men take just the boys and talk about issues that impact men and boys. And I would take the women and girls and talk about issues that impact women and girls. We've had dorm dialogues, because dorms, you're already separated by gender, right? Like, so our junior counselors, our college age students really took questions about, in Latino culture, there's machismo, right? Like, what does this mean to you? When have you experienced it? And just about gender roles. What are gender roles? What are gender norms? When have you experienced this the most? What have you been told about your gender? And especially for our young Latinas, the power. It is powerful to be seen, to, I think when we name the things that we don't often talk about, but very much experience in our culture, and that includes race, all the isms, right? Racism, sexism, the way our LGBTQ community is impacted, but we don't often talk about it. And when we create spaces where we can talk about that, I'm thinking right now too about Fernell Miller's racial healing circles that she holds, where we talk about race, your experience with your race, and the stories that I've come to in those spaces, right? Like as a biracial white presenting person who doesn't often enter BIPOC spaces because I know what I look like, right? Like I'm my Wonder Bread complexion, right? Like my Aryan dream. Like, so yeah, I think affinity spaces can be really amazing spaces to feel seen and heard and like you belong somewhere and like you're not alone. And I've had those experiences myself. You and I went to, what was that called? Where Do I Belong? Leticia Nieto's workshops. And it was a lot of multicultural or biracial people. And I had a group of a few other women that I was put in a breakout who were also the white one in their family. And just that experience was so liberating, beautiful, exciting, because we all got to talk about that, right? Like about asking your parents if you're adopted. And are you sure? Are you sure dad's my dad, right? Like that we all had those experiences. And I've seen that with our Latino students with having to translate at the doctor's office or at school. And that feeling like I'm not alone. This is not just my isolated, insular experience. This is you too. This is you, and this is you, and we get to share in that. And there's something profound to me about that every time.
There's something I'm hearing and I'll come to about just the word and the experience of relating or to be in relation, right? To have these relationships of me too, you too, me too. There's something about like going through it together or having these shared experiences that are often overlooked or really just not brought to the forefront. And so also what I'm hearing is to be intentional, really inviting an authentic curiosity, a genuine inquiry. You know, we're not giving the answers. We're really inviting the questions.
Yeah.
And for young people, in adolescence, coming of age, this very important time of our existence, right? And really thinking about where my worth is, how is that invited into educational spaces, my own dignity, my own beliefs and understandings, but also my new thoughts and ways of connecting. There's something very much I hear in your reflections there about humanizing each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a big fan of curiosity anyway. It keeps me out of judgment. I think we are in a time when we are raised with a lot of judgment, with a lot of discarding the whole person based on, like something they said or a belief they hold. And I'm always intrigued and curious. I feel like, oh, where does that belief come from? Where did it
It's almost the same thing as this kind of hard discipline. Even I don't know if you're alluding to this, but I get the concept of being a cancel culture.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're just dismissed entirely versus like where's the learning? And I always want to get back to the learning and the growth, especially when we do harm or say something offensive or are off base in some way. I want to know that. I want that to be brought to my attention, but not totally dismissed as though I can't learn.
Like Vince, you said this one thing that's really messed up, and so you're a horrible person, and right, like you shouldn't get to do this work, or right, like, yeah, it's kind of like done. When we could be curious. And again, that moment of reflection, like I like turning that mirror of curiosity on myself as well. Like, why did I say that? Where does that idea come from? Why do I hold that? Because we've talked too about having, what our culture gives us. Sometimes we have sexist thoughts or ideas or racist thoughts or ideas or ableist thoughts or ideas or homophobic, right? Like, and very often being confronted with that is actually an opportunity, right? Like I remember being on Twitter for a while, I had the conviction that the South should have seceded from that was my like, okay, just let them go. Just go ahead and like cut off Florida and let it float without really considering who else lives there, right? Like without really considering who that would impact if we pulled up a giant fence and we're like, especially up here in the Pacific Northwest, right? Like there's some wealth here. There's some some structures in place that where we take care of each other a little bit better, maybe than in some other states. And I was really challenged on Twitter. There was like a pile-on of folks, and I could have gotten defensive, right? Like, and been like, no, I am right. But I really had a moment. It was like, oh, I am wrong. And where do my ideas come from? Did I make it so black and white? Why was that such a simple thing in my brain? How could I forget about whole populations of people who would be very negatively impacted by this, who don't have the means or the desire to move from where they're at? And I think those opportunities for growth, to be allowed to see things differently, right? Like to get a different perspective and broaden your own or adjust your own, is so important. And I think especially an educator, and especially as educators, right? For us not to get stuck in this, well, I've always thought this, or I've always done this, and it's always been fine. And now you're telling me that's wrong. Well, then that must mean you are wrong. No, it could be that things have evolved. It could be that I was always wrong, that was never a good idea, that was never really well thought through. Yeah, so I really like being in curiosity. And that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be addressed. I'm really grateful that people called me out, right? Like they said, you are wrong, that is messed up. Because I think that needs to be addressed. And I had to acknowledge some things there too, right? And be, yeah, I'm so sorry, you are right. Thank you for helping me see this is now my viewpoint. And I'm going to leave this post up because I don't want to like just erase what happened here, but I will put a post right underneath addressing this and saying, hey, what I set up there is messed up and short-sighted and ignores some realities.
So I think what we've been talking about, especially in the story, is really thinking about, right, people with people and what kind of learning happens there. Especially in education. But of course, there's going to be a lot of folks listening to this that are like, well, we have to learn science and math and how to write and all the things of what we think traditionally of like subject matters or content in schools. So almost what I hear in this conversation here is really around like social emotional learning and basically how to be with other people in a good way. So I'm curious if you could address that, or
I don't think it's limited to social emotional learning either. I'm immediately thinking about the elementary school that my mom worked at. They would have these 6-week-long projects. So I remember it was Middle Ages one year where they learned everything about the Middle Ages. And then the last week they would create. So they would make bread the way they did in the Middle Ages. I think they even brewed beer just to go through the process. Another year, they were looking at service industry and put on a restaurant experience. They examined for their 10th anniversary that the school existed, they did circus. And that meant really examining the culture, right? Like one thing that really, like I still remember from their Middle Ages project, I think I was a teenager at the time, but I would come to the school often to help out or just go see my mom and my siblings. The kids were making signs for their little shops, but there would be no writing on it because in the Middle Ages, most people could not write. That was something for the wealthy and the elites. And so if you were selling bread, you had to have a picture of bread, right? Like, so using their artistic skills, what does it entail to run a restaurant, right? Like that includes math, that includes reading and writing, that includes interactions with folks, that includes collaboration. So I think having more of an interdisciplinary approach, right? Like what we do at the Dare to Dream Academy, where we walk through the hero's journey, we do a lot of writing. Like our students do a lot of writing. And it is about their experience, right? It's them telling stories about themselves, their reflections. They work with a college-age mentor too, who looks like them, who comes from the same background, who speaks the same language or languages. Yeah, I think when you create spaces of belonging that are interesting to our students, then the learning comes, right? Like it happens. I remember that moment this past year at Dare to Dream at Eastern, where we went to listen to some, there was a woman who did Chicana studies and one of their camp folks. And they each told their personal stories. And there's a moment, right? And again, this when the Chicana studies department head talked about how Latinas are perceived or how they are portrayed in media. And she named a few tropes. And there you see the girls sit up, right? Like you see them lean forward. You see them being like, wait, what did she just say? And the beautiful thing then is, and I really love getting to work with you because I get to see you when you're just in your teaching and broaden that, right? Like, so rather than just go back and go to our lesson, they had so many questions. What does Latinx mean? What does Chicanx or Chicana mean? What is this, right? Like, and really just breaking down some of the language, some of the history, your personal history, right? Like examining this when you got to college was, I think, one of the richest lessons we had. And that is when they all really tuned in and they did not tune out again after that, right? Like, so we really, when you hook the students with something that matters to them, that applies to them, they will write about it if you ask them to write about it, right? And we had students who have varying skill levels, right? Like, so there are students who are still working out their handwriting and don't write a lot because they're really self-conscious about their handwriting. And there are students who could be in honors classes, right? Like who write really, really well, who are very articulate, have a good grasp of a really wide range of vocabulary and idiom, and inviting it all in and practice whatever level you're at. Right. Let us know. Let us hear your voice.
I want to say that so relevance invites skill development.
I believe that, yes.
Are there any particular challenges that you see are obstacles to achieving, this kinds of empowering types of education for our young people?
I think there are
And in addition, like how to address
funding. I think ultimately, well, there are a few things. I see the shift since No Child Left Behind towards the focus on standardized testing, I think has really been detrimental for schools, educators, and students. We've seen students who were brilliant who would not have tested well, like lots and lots of them. I had a student one year who couldn't attend class because she was moving cattle with her parents. And I'm just like, what a unique experience do you have moving cattle from one field to another for the ranch that your parents run? That's not something that they would ever talk about. So I asked them to make up for their attendance to tell me about it, to either write or record a video about their experience. And when we can invite the whole student, right, like that's when you see their brilliance. When Dare to Dream, especially when we went online a few years, right, like we went to online school and we really broadened how students could turn in their assignments. They could make it an art project, they could make it a video. And the artwork we saw because of that, just the brilliant, beautiful, impressive things that they turned in that would not show up on a test, right? Like the way that they were able to tell their stories. So I think that is a big obstacle. That is not necessarily, I don't think standardized tests really tell you the whole story of the school, of the educators, of the students. I think that also cuts into planning time a lot of the time. I think teachers need more planning time. What we've also heard from a lot of teachers is the isolation they experience just being in their classroom by themselves, especially because there is no time to talk to their peers, to process, to have that experience of, oh, that's you too. You struggle with this too. I remember we did a circle with a group of educators and from the same school, and we just held circle and we talked about their jobs basically. And there were a lot of teachers who were really grateful to hear from colleagues that they were struggling with the same thing. And that really, while you are experiencing this in isolation, you are not alone. We are all experiencing this. And, that feeling too of like, there's something wrong with me because I can't figure this out, or I'm struggling, or I'm having a hard time with this. No, there is nothing wrong with you. It's just really hard. This is a hard job. The circumstances are hard, right? Like it's a lot that is asked of you. And when we never validate that, when we never explore that, then we just kind of carry that with us and it weighs on us, and we don't get to unburden that and be our best and most selves. So I am a big advocate of getting rid of standardized testing, of of broadening what an educational experience can mean. I wonder if you could talk about that, a program through CISPAS too, where students go outdoors for their PE credit.
Outdoor, I'm going to forget the exact acronym, but essentially students get a semester's worth of credit in physical education and health and nutrition, where they spend is it 6 or 7 days out, full days, complete full day, not a school day, but a whole actual day, from sunrise to sunset and a little beyond, where they're thinking about taking a trip out into the wilderness. And then, we're not thinking about planning for, and then doing so. And overnight, with the tents and streams and the actual world. And so I observed them for a week. I got to take photographs for this project. And many of the students who were often in front of screens, I think many of them came from, I know many of them came from a high school that was focused on STEM. And so they actually were kind of sedentary, where they just sat a lot in front of screens. And I remember 4 young men in particular, like trying to put the tent together, and the actual lived experience of that. So on paper, in theory, there's one way of thinking, but the actual doing of and using your hands was a whole different kind of learning, right? And way to be. There's something really profound then as well about connecting to the natural world. Mm-hmm. And I was always wondering, what will this experience mean for them 10 years from now? When they have families and children, what does it mean for them to connect with the land? There's a whole study into eco-psychology that I've done in my past around being in the natural world, and what does that mean for our psychology, for our relationality. There's just a whole bunch of learning that often gets overlooked with being in the natural world. So I'm all for outdoor school and all those kinds of things as well, which CISPAS Learning Center clearly offered. I'm curious here, for those folks listening to this podcast, if you had any particular calls to action.
Working with women and girls, really, at the early years at La Cima, this was before I joined the staff, there were gender campfires. I think I had been interested before, partly because I was raised with a brother who is a year older. We were really close. We were treated as equal, but not really, right? Like, so there was that nagging feeling that it wasn't quite equitable, right? Like that. And as I grew older, I was really interested in that and where that shows up in our society and how that is often invisible. And so the gender campfires really sparked something in me that I wanted to create spaces for women and girls to talk about the issues that we face. And we were doing Me Too before there was a Me Too, right? Like, and not just about sexual abuse, but about many, many things that impacted us. So that, I think, is something that's really important. I mean, again, like, I think it's affinity groups. What I found there, what I experienced there, and where women make up half the population. So that's a really easy, like, affinity group to step into. There's lots of us, but I think creating those spaces where you can speak to people who are just like you or who've had the same experiences, or who understand what it means when you say X, right? Like when you say, oh, I have such a hard time with this, and they're like, oh my goodness, me too. I think that can go a long way.
Thank you. Yeah, the power of affinity space. What I'm leaning to here is, as you point that out, and I am so grateful to have this group of men to gather with in a regular way for almost 3 years now. And my experience with Jerry Theo's work in California this last summer to hold circle for the National Compadres Network, a 3-day experience of circle, of literally just holding circle, all this practice given to us by our ancestors, and being in relation, right? And what's fascinating to me about circle is that mostly what we're doing is listening.
Yeah.
You get to have your share, but most of the time, like the great majority, the fraction of however many people are there, you're witnessing. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is really the power of circle. But what's bubbling to the top of how much pressure there is on us culturally as Latino men to be breadwinners, it's just a lot of pressure. I mean, that's the reality, and the stress that creates, and the kind of self-imposed, like, whipping of oneself, trying to reach, this narrative, a story of what, man is supposed to be. Mm-hmm. Especially Chicano men or Latino men, or however we identify. Kind of being surprised by it, that all of us are experiencing this really intense pressure that we don't really speak about, right, until we get into opportunities like Circle. for this affinity space.
Which also allows for empathy, right? Like for each other and for ourselves. I really love the practice of circle too. And in our current school system, there is no time. Like circle takes a lot of time. It means we slow down, right? Like I'd love to see more of that in at all levels, right? Like for our teachers, for our paraeducators, for our administrators, to be able to slow down and sit and listen. We had a circle with a staff that was in crisis. And at the end of the circle, one of the men spoke up and said, I have a hard time with empathy. I'm really working on that lately. And today was a really good exercise in empathy. I feel empathy today, just having listened to these folks' stories and their voices.
The final question I've been asking here in our interviews, and of course, knowing you and that you grew up in a different country in the Netherlands, but also how brilliant you are, just in terms of capacity and skills. You speak 4 languages, which is really kind of unheard of in the States in terms of what school offers you, right? So I'm curious, how did your schooling impact you?
I struggled. And I also want a disclaimer, like I used to speak 4 languages. It does fade. So I can understand a lot still, but I don't know if I could still speak very fluently. But English is also a second language for me. I really struggled. I'm dyslexic and I was not diagnosed. I think there was some question about it as I was growing up. I remember being tested a lot and then being told, like there was this kind of relief, like, no, she's fine. But I think I just picked up on sight words and was able to figure that out. But in first grade, when you learn spelling, right, like I stuck to grammar rules very rigidly. And then it would be very upsetting to me when there were exceptions, right? Like, why are there these rules when they're not like consistent? So that was really hard for me to understand or to accept even that there were exceptions to these rules and that I just had to learn those. I really wanted things to be simpler, to be like, this is the guideline, follow the guideline, you're going to be good, right? Like kind of the way it is in math, when 1 + 1 is always going to be 2. This formula is always going to be this formula. I wrote my letters backwards. So when other students could go to recess, I still had to write my words. I thought that meant that I was dumb. Like for a long time, I just thought I was not very smart. Then in 6th grade in Holland, you test to see what level of high school you go to. There's different levels and different lengths. So there's a 4-year high school, 5-year, 6-year. And I tested really high, unexpectedly. Everybody was surprised, most of all my mother. And that was a clue, like, oh, maybe I'm not stupid. And then it took me until my junior year in high school, where it was because I had a boyfriend whose entire family had really high IQs. They'd all been tested, like that was part of their identity. And I realized I could hang. I was fine in conversations with them. I loved that they had the news on in their home all the time. They didn't have TV. They had a wall of books in their living room that I've aspired to ever since. And I had that moment of like, oh, wait a minute, I am smart. But before that, I failed a lot. I didn't know how to study. The only method I was given in elementary school was that thing where you repeat. So you say 1 and then you say 1, 2, and then you say 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you learn the first ones really well. And then numbers 76 through 100, you don't know at all, right? I thought repetition was boring. And so I refused to just repeat. I didn't know that you could take notes in different colors or that you could doodle while listening, or all the things that I do now that help me pay attention or help me learn were actively discouraged, right? Like, so I didn't get very good grades. Like I failed French for the first 3 years, like failed hard. Like it was embarrassingly low grades, like unheard of low, because I just wouldn't study. And my French teacher was very much répétez s'il vous plaît, just repeat, please. And then I got a new teacher. So the first 3 years, same teacher, failed. Then my last 2 years of high school, I had a different teacher who would practice a lot in class, use the language, right? Like speak the language, even if you're not sure, we'll figure it out. Had conversations, and I loved it. And then suddenly wanted to learn all those grammar things that I resisted learning in the first 3 years. Suddenly I'm pouring into this, like, I want to know how to conjugate this verb. I want to know what that grammar rule is. And then I graduated with honors in French, or got an honorable mention for getting a really high grade. So failed really hard, switched teacher and approach, and then suddenly I can. So it was tricky. I feel like it was a tricky thing to navigate. There was also a lot of neglect and abuse in my home. And I never felt, especially in high school, like that was taken into consideration. I remember I was in trouble a lot for being tardy or for being absent. I would always be asked for a note from my mom, which I would not like. Just negotiating that with my mother was much more of a headache than negotiating with my principal at school, right? Like, and I remember telling my principal, or there were vice principals for each year in my high school, just telling him, like, that note is never going to come. You would have to call, but it's not going to, like, I cannot get that from my mother. And they would just say, just bring a note, just bring a note, just bring a note. My dad had passed away, which added to the chaos in our home. In my senior year, I finally just started writing my own notes. And to kind of drive the point home, at one point I signed it, my mother. Kim was not able to come to school because XYZ, signed my mother. And I was just like, I want you to know this is me writing it. Like, you're setting this as the requirement, right? Like, you need a note from but you're not even getting a note from my mother. This is me writing these. And at some point there is that kind of defiance in me where I wanted them to know, hey, this is kind of silly.
So that's fascinating to me. We're back to even right in a whole different country, a whole different system, back to compliance just for the sake of compliance without actual context or reality of what you're observing. Yeah,
I understand now, looking back, that I was a headache for this administrator, right? Like, because they need the notes and they need to. And I wish he had asked me at some point, how are you doing in your home life? How come you're so often late?
Or gotten you help or connected into a counselor or all the available kind of services that you could take advantage of.
Yeah, I wish he had been curious.
Yeah.
Rather than just annoyed. I think it would have meant a lot to me at that time. I felt really isolated.
And there's something back to the story of your French teacher when that switched, about connection and relevance to the content, which sparks your own motivation as well. So I kind of am interested in that thread through this conversation, right? That when we ourselves, when we with young people, when we with our colleagues are connected, and there's a real sense of relevance for us, that this is a meaningful activity, engagement, that we're called to some kind of purposeful learning, that goes much, much further. Well, thank you so much. This is fun. I really appreciate your openness and willingness to wrap up the series and this conversation. As you know, as my partner, as someone who's witnessed my own career and I've witnessed yours, and really being a partnership, not only in our lives, but in our vocations, right, in our careers and in our service. So it was really, really wonderful to have this conversation with you.
You were right. This was fun. Thank you for having me on.